And for those individuals who are starting to join in, who are attendees, welcome. Please send us a message in the chat if there is any audio issues that you are facing at this time. Otherwise, what we're going to do is allow people to continue to join, and we'll get started here a little shortly. So we're just going to hang out here and welcome again. And again, to the attendees who, as people are starting to join, hi, welcome. This is also me speaking just to check your audio, so please reach out in the chat if you have any issues. We'll be getting started shortly. We're just allowing folks to come and join us for the session.
That is a very cute dog.
Thank you.
And hello to the attendees. We're continuing to wait for about a minute longer as we let people come and get settled in. Please reach out in the chat if you have any audio issues, but otherwise welcome, and we'll get started here in just about a minute. Okay, other folks may come to join, but I think we should get started. It's now 12:02. And again, if there are any issues, please reach out in chat. I'll be happy to respond. Otherwise, I pass it over to Penn.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Penelope Adams-Moon, and it's my great privilege to direct the Center for Teaching and Learning here at the University of Washington. And I'm so excited about today because we're launching our new Reflection and Practice series. And this series builds on a series some of you may be familiar with, the Advances in Higher Education Research series. We've rebooted that series as Reflection and Practice to stress how much we value a reflective teaching practice. That is a practice defined by a growth mindset and committed to asking questions about what we do in the classroom. And sometimes those questions will evolve into formal research projects like Dr. Brickman's going to talk about today, or they may exist simply as personal commitments to being mindful, observant, and adaptable when it comes to what we do in the classroom. The title, Reflection and Practice, is meant to welcome speakers who wish to share everything from formal research findings to their thoughtful reflections on their own practice. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to my very good colleague, Professor Colleen Craig, who will be facilitating today's talk.
Thank you, Penn. As Penn said, I'm Colleen Craig, and I'm a teaching professor in chemistry here at University of Washington, and I'm also the Academic and Student Affairs Teaching Fellow working out of the Center for Teaching and Learning. And it is my honor and privilege to welcome Professor Peggy Brickman to the Reflection and Practice Speaker Series. Professor Brickman is the Josiah Miggs Distinguished Teaching Professor of Plant Biology at the University of Georgia, where she is an award-winning instructor of large enrollment biology courses. She also leads a robust research program in biology education. Her research expertise includes developing instruments to assess student motivation to learn science and their scientific literacy, the role of instructional feedback on the willingness of faculty to change their teaching practices, and examining the role of group interactions in promoting self-regulated learning in large enrollment courses. Today, Professor Brickman will tell us a little bit about her work on student reactions to group work. Based on her findings from in-depth interviews with students, she will describe effective strategies for implementing group work in ways that motivate all students to participate and thereby ensure that they reap the benefits of collaborating with their peers. Please welcome Peggy Brickman.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I have not visited UW, but I would love to, and I have such great respect for the campus and certainly your biology education research group. I love them. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I've got some great slides to sort of talk you through some of the research that I'll be talking about today. I will start by saying that this whole project began with a graduate student, Youngjung Chang, who was at UGA, but she's right now at the University of Buffalo. And she was in learning technologies. And so she was really interested in how I was implementing group work in my classes. And I should say these are very large classes. I'll sort of talk you through, we'll think about some of the challenges of that setting. But she was really interested in characterizing what was going on in the classroom, especially after she sat in for a semester and said, there's a lot of problems that are happening. So hopefully I will be able to steer you clear of some of those problems. There is also an episode on this. Teaching for Student Success is a podcast that Steve Ravenau has created. It's great interviews if you haven't checked it out. And there is an episode for this. And I will say that I'm going to share all the slides afterwards. So a lot of this information is there. So don't panic if you can't access it. Just want to introduce a little bit of some of my collaborators. And I know this slide is incredibly busy, and that's because we have such a great education research group at the University of Georgia. So I have most of my collaborators are here and they're amazing. We also run a research experience for undergraduates, and you can see I've got 7 that I was lucky enough to work with. And then many of our graduate students have come from both the College of Education that we have here, and also students who are pursuing a PhD in a science field, but are really interested in understanding more about learning in the classroom. And so as was described in the introduction, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the things I work on, which is how do we get collaborative learning to work, especially in large enrollment courses. So why did I do group work and why do people do it? Well, because everybody recommends it. So here's just 2, both sort of publications from the National Research Council, and that it's been recommended throughout as a way to get undergraduates, especially in science and engineering courses, to do better and to be more efficient in their classes. So the ideas that come across in collaborative learning or group work are students get to exchange ideas and reasoning. They get to communicate their own understanding through those discussions and explanations, and their ability to build on those. And so there have been several different meta-analyses. The 2 that I've mentioned there are just on post-secondary students, but there are a host of others that have been done on K through 12 students, showing effect sizes of, a half a standard deviation for students that are learning collaboratively. So, of course, that's why I wanted to do it in my own courses. And so before we get started, I was curious if people wanted to just chat with me and tell me some problems that you've experienced with group work, either as a student or as an instructor. And I'm assuming they're just going to fly by because I can't imagine that no one has had a problem in either of those capacities. So I'll give you a minute to chat me something. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Doing all the work. Yes, because you guys are good students. Meet outside of class. Whoa, here it comes. Disappearing or ghosting. Disengagement. Yeah. Oh, just rather do the work yourself. I totally agree. Actively take responsibility. Absolutely. We're all laughing about this. Oh. slinging on objectives, aligning, team writing. Oh, writing is a real problem. And then the free writing. Okay. All right. So I feel like everybody is mentioning a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about right here. So if you didn't see yours, I'll add it later. So these are a couple of papers that have come about since the 1980s on problems with group work. So the ones that you talked about, we mentioned conflict, this idea of lack of participation. And then at some point, students will withdraw. They'll just like, I'm not going to engage in this because I don't think I'm getting anything out of it. And there's some formal terms that people use and have used for this. Social loafing, right? Is this, there's 6 people in the group. If I don't do anything, nobody's really going to tell if I don't do anything. So we call that social loafing. And then free riding is where you're absolutely knowingly letting people do all of the work for you. You're not just like reducing your input. You are completely not putting anything in. And then what I love the most, because probably everybody here is very good students, is the sucker effect. And that's where someone who's a competent student, the free riders aren't doing their work. And so what do? You reduce your effort or you procrastinate on purpose, because then it'll force the others to actually participate. So all of these will have a really negative effect on the work that comes out, because we're not all contributing. And so it's going to be a problem. Some of the other things that faculty struggle with in particular, there's like conflicting recommendations on how you form the groups. So the idea would be like, well, I want a mixture. I want some students who are really knowledgeable, maybe some students who aren't, so they can kind of benefit from each other. So there have been suggestions to maybe figure out achievement levels or performance levels of students, and then create your groups with a combination of maybe some higher scoring and some lower scoring students. And what I'll say is that there is some evidence that those kind of heterogeneous groups actually do better. So these are Jensen and Lawson. This is for a very didactic kind of lecture type instructor, and Weld from 1999. Then there's a whole bunch, including that same Jensen and Lawson paper from 2011, where homogeneous academic groups, both high performers and low performers in terms of your courses, do better than the heterogeneous groups. And then there's papers that show no relationship between achievement and ability grouping. So this is a problem, because instructors are being given lots of different recommendations. And I felt the same way, when I was trying to get my groups to work together. There are some support strategies that have been kind of prescribed. So I have my little prescription on the left here. And I will say, I'll put a plug in for this group work tour that's on the Life Sciences Education. If you haven't seen that, it's great. I did it with Christy Graham Christy Wilson and in 2017. So we sort of went through some of the big papers that have been written about group work, and we made like a checklist and some suggestions. So if I don't get to all of them, that is a great resource to kind of check out later. So one thing that's worthwhile is giving students a role. So you subdivide the work so that they know what to do, and you can identify someone who might be loafing a bit and not contributing. You can have things like group contracts, where students ahead of time write out what their expectations are and what some penalties will be if students don't perform in the way that they have agreed. And then there are things like peer evaluations, where students are allowed at the end of the semester or halfway through the semester even to give feedback on their peers in terms of their performance. And so one of the things, I started using peer evaluations. I was convinced to do this by someone great in engineering. But then when I started reading about it, I was like, I'm seeing some very bad things happening on anonymous peer evaluations. So some of the things that are kind of obvious are that students aren't going to be honest. They don't want to get in trouble with their peers. And they feel like they would be like ratting them out if they didn't give them a good score. So that's a problem. One of the things I thought was really interesting was that they looked at courses and whether or not they had end of semester peer evaluations, and then asked the students how they felt about their teamwork. And they actually found that those classes that used peer evaluations with some kind of penalty where your grade is going to be deducted if you didn't work are actually more likely to be associated with students saying, I did not enjoy being in the team. So it doesn't seem to be really helping. And then finally, it turns out that the cohesiveness of the group, like how well they get along, having a smaller group, like 3 to 4 students. And then I love this, the option to divorce a team member were rated more effective by students in terms of trying to keep the group cohesive and actually working. So what we were interested in are what are students' perceptions of some of these different kind of prescriptions. And mainly because they're really time consuming. The more students you have, the more time you're going to have to spend doing group contracts and assigning roles and checking in on these things. And even the peer evaluation is going to take time because you're going to have to, send it out to students and compile the data, et cetera. So these are specific things that we wanted to examine. Just generally, what are their perceptions? And this was conducted by Yun Zhang. She did the interviews of students anonymously to try to give me a feel for what was going on. But then what I was curious about is seems kind of maybe obvious, but if you're doing really well, maybe your perceptions are good versus someone who's in, a bad team. Like they'll say, I'm just in a bad team. And then you guys mentioned all of these, I don't want conflict. I want to be able to identify problem groups and to be able to intervene. So it's which of these is kind of working in that sense? So that was the kind of questions we went into it with. And in sort of research terms, and I'm going to use some kind of color coding because there was a lot of stuff that we asked. And so here we have, do perceptions differ between students in high and low performing groups? So high for me is arrow up, blue, good. Low performing, and really we're talking about poor grades. Either they didn't complete assignments or they got poor grades on assignments. And then the little yellow boxes there, little call outs, are for interviews. What perception, what did they think? What did they say about this? And then do perceptions differ between high and low scoring students? Based on, like we said, curious about if you're in a mixed group where there's mixed ability students or all the students are the same, what are their perceptions? Because again, you think, well, maybe they're different. Maybe you're in a really great group. You're having the best time of your life. And then finally, could we ask students to provide insight into these support strategies for communication and feedback, like the peer evaluations or their group contracts? And we, like I said, we used kind of some quantitative data. So these are their actual performance scores on group and individual assignments and tests. And then, like I said, in yellow, these are either anonymous peer evaluations where they left comments or actual interviews that we did with students. So I wanted to give you guys just a minute, because I've gone through a lot, just to write, what's your prediction, right? If you've been the good student in a group, what do you think your prediction is for the perceptions of high and low performing groups and whether it's mixed or heterogeneous? So the great question is, the status determined based on grades prior or during the class? And this is all during the class. So this is okay, I'm a good biology student versus not, what your grade was coming out. Although that's a great question because sometimes people will use a prior course. Okay, so I got a lot of interesting predictions. Homogeneous groups worked better. This is a lot. This is great. And actually, when I looked into this, a lot of the stuff about homogeneous groups is the reasons why we have gifted education now. There's a lot of data from K through 12 and middle school showed that students who are high performing made the greatest gains in high performance groups with other high performing students. So that was part of the reasoning behind that. Okay, yes. And do students know they're in a heterogeneous group? I'm with you completely. Okay, so had a little chance to make some predictions. So let me tell you about the instructional context. I teach very large courses, so there were about 246 students enrolled. This is an introductory biology course for non-science majors. So there's no prerequisite. It's like a general education course, so it doesn't really count toward going on to other classes, and we have no prior grades. You can't kind of tell, like, are students good biology students or not from that. And in the second week of classes, we have a 15-week semester. The students self-selected. So at the time, I was like, I can't deal with this. I don't know if I should do mixed or homogeneous. So I'm just going to let them choose their own groups. And I use permanent groups. So there are about 65 groups that have between 4 to 5 members per group. And then I used all the prescribed strategies. I used assigned roles. I did a group contract. And then we did peer evaluations both at the midpoint and at the end of the semester. So I was just following the instructions that I was given. And then in terms of the instructional context, that we do 5 units that go throughout the semester. And in each semester, we do both a combination of individual and group work. So individual is, I'm going to have like little people there as they're scoring. And then the 40% of the class was on group-based work. So that's our kind of group performance where I have little clusters of them. And then we did a combination of things. So they had in-class work, so individual quiz questions that they would take with a clicker, group worksheets that they would work on and fill in collaboratively. We also had some outside of class activities, which a lot of groups don't. They'll just have the, stuff they do in class. But we have kind of a project-based learning in this course. So they had a final project and they would do research for their projects. And so that was almost a third, 28% of their grade came from that. And then finally, they also had tests, and they were allowed to take their test alone and then also as a group. So we do it as like a staged exam. They take their test first and then they can take it as a group. So there's lots of opportunity for them to interact with each other and a lot of responsibility, both inside and outside of class for them. So like I said, we were really interested in group performance data. So we looked at quantitative data. And in this case, we did sort of ranked ordered group assignments and group test scores. Some of the group assignments you just sort of got completion. Some you got like an actual rubric, for example, for their projects, and then the tests were test scores. And so we sort of divided them in the bottom 50% and the top 50%. And some of this was because we were doing the interviews during the semester. And so we wanted to be able to identify right away to interview students who were in a low performing group or a high performing group. So we kind of ranked these, and this is what it ended up at the end of the semester. So we've got number of groups that had interviews. We had 7 groups with interviews, and then 5 groups at the lower end that had interviewees in them. So one of the things that we looked at, we did not arrange these students according to their individual performance to form the group. So we didn't make heterogeneous or homogeneous groups, but we were curious, like, what are students self-selecting when they get into groups? And so we used their individual scores, so things they did on their own tests or their own quizzes, all that individual 60% of the course. And we just ranked them in like top, mid, and bottom third of the class. We call it scoring ability. So it's not really performance per se, but it's like if they scored on some assignments. And what we found is kind of complicated. So the high performance groups, I know this is not going to shock anyone, they tended to have a higher proportion of high performance students in them, which makes sense, right? They're doing well. And so we had, 55 of these groups of these heterogeneous groups that had all, high performing students, mid and low. So this is the sort of breakdown of those 28 heterogeneous groups that were high performance. Of the low performance groups, they tended to have a higher proportion of students in them that were low performers. It just kind of makes sense in a way. We did have some homogeneous groups where they were all high performers or high to mid and all low performers. They weren't a ton of them. But we did have some groups that were heterogeneous at either end. So most of our mixed groups were kind of very mixed back and forth. So we knew kind of both the group and the individual scoring level of the students. And we were kind of curious to see if there were going to be differences between their perceptions of group work or perceptions of some of the activities that we did. So one of the other things we did in terms of quantitative data was that at the time, we not only were using peer evaluations as kind of qualitative comments that they could give to each other, but also the responses to items. And so we had 8 items that said, you know, on a scale from 1 to 4, 1 being poor and 4 being excellent, how would you rate each of the students in your group in terms of preparation, participation, collaboration, attitude, and performance? And we did this both at the mid and at the end of the semester. So that was really interesting because we had those peer evaluation scores. And really, I just wanted to know if they were any good, right? Were they actually honest? Because I knew that the data said that they're often not honest. Okay, so here's our sort of methods for our qualitative data. Like I said, in yellow here, we have interviews. And so we interviewed 15 students. We did both high and low scoring students in both high and low performing groups. So you can see here, we have a high performing group on the right, and we interviewed 5 high scoring students in that group and 3 low scoring students. So they're kind of mixed in here. And then we also interviewed high and low performing students in a low performing group. And we did a little bit more of the low scoring because you remember the low performing groups tended to have higher numbers of lower scoring students. And we did them during the final weeks of class. And we asked, how do you feel about your performance in class? What are the benefits and challenges of group work? How did the group handle roles and discussions? And then how did you perceive group and individual activities? Just to remind you again, we had like this sort of large range in which students performed in groups, and we're choosing students who are both at the higher and the lower half of that course. So the other thing that we did was we had peer evaluation comments, and we had over 1,200 answers, comments to both mid and end of semester. So they'd say, you know, rank your group members with this 4-point scale and these 8 questions. And we'd say, just give us some feedback about each of the members of your group. And so it says, please provide written comments about each of your team members so they can learn how you view their contributions. After all evaluations are submitted, they'll be able to read the comments, but not tell who they came from. And remember, there's only 3 or 4 people in the group, so potentially. So what did we do? We took all of these interviews, both the in-depth and the comments that we got on the peer evaluations, and we did a kind of a thematic analysis, which really was just, what are we hearing about? What are some themes that emerged during the reading of all the interviews? And then Yunjang and I reviewed all the themes and then looked at quotes that exemplify the themes, revised them, and see if they really are still holding together as a single theme. And then we, like it says, looked at patterns to provide information to help us understand the impact and process of group work. So, results. What did we find? What we found is that your perception of the value of the group activities didn't depend necessarily on your group, but on your own abilities. So we found that not only in a high, both in a high and a low performance group, if you're a high scoring student, you felt in general more likely to say things like, this was more real life situations. I found them interesting. It was more relatable and like scientific theories that would apply to you. And it's based on how it would affect something in real life. Now that's from my instructional point, which is most of our group activities are real kind of applications of the material. And so rather than a test question, the group activities became an opportunity to see how genetic testing worked in the real life. So both high and low performing groups, if you're a high scoring student, you're like, yeah, I think this is really critical to me. And unfortunately, and this hurt, lower scoring students, on the other hand, perceived the group activities as just time consuming. Here's a quote, why do all that and spend an hour going through all of that stuff when I could just finish it in 10 minutes? And something that doesn't seem very important. So I was like, wow, that is a basic philosophy about or sort of why you're in the class and what you're doing in the group activities. Not so much that group activities are bad, but that like the choices I was making for the group activities were really not coming across to a low performing student, at least in terms of their scoring on exams and activities. I will say that you guys are not alone if you experience social loafing. It did not matter. So high scoring students, low scoring students, they all experience social loafing. So here's a high scoring student who's like taking on more of the role, says they just sent me all copy and paste. They didn't do any research, follow any APA format. They simply sent me a link of their resources and said, here's the link. So I have to go back to the website that they'd found and I had to summarize them. Same thing. Even low scoring students would say it's more difficult to get all the members to contribute equally, especially if someone's doing all the work and then other people feel like they can relax. You're doing all the work and I can just sit back and get 100, sort of like the prisoner effect, which I love. But yes, so not surprising. They also, unfortunately, completely ignored their group contracts. So here's a high scoring student who says, it's just another assignment that we had to do so we could leave. I feel like I am the jailer. We know we'd follow through when we had stuff and we really never had to use the group contract, is another comment. And then the low scoring student said they rarely followed through on any punishments or criticized group members' behaviors. And Ethan says, I'd never tell these guys because I didn't want them to say something about me. Of course, these are pseudonyms for the students. However, I did kind of come away with that thinking, you're thinking, okay, is anything good? Most of them still, even if they had negative experiences, they came away with some positive perceptions anyway. So high scoring students would say like, just to be able to talk to people about it and kind of work through it and figure it out. It was a nice little support system. You didn't feel like you were alone in the class. So these are really good students, right? They're the top of the class. And you think, well, they are in this group and maybe they feel like they're pulling the other students along. But no, they really recognized, for the most part, that it was a great opportunity for them, even if they're high supporting, to kind of get that experience. And then the low scoring students said our group got along a lot better with just interacting with each other. I've definitely learned better in a group because I had the opportunity to kind of answer some of their questions, which helps me understand it more. So even a student who's not really doing particularly well in the course is still experiencing some positives from being able to engage in that like exchange of ideas and discussions. So that was positive. So we also did some in-depth interviews, remember, from low and high performing groups. And what we found is some similar, but also some different perceptions that students had. So we said both report social loafing, but they also social comfort in groups. We know good use of group contracts and role assignments, possibly and probably likely because there's a kind of fear of retribution and damaging that kind of working relationship that they had developed, that they really cared for and cared about. And we found in general that higher scoring students recognize the value of group activities more than lower scoring students. And that was regardless of how well their group as a whole was doing. It just seemed like kind of a disconnect that was going on there. So that's the conclusion from the in-depth interviews. Let me just finish with talking about these anonymous peer evaluations. So our question really was, do they work? These are anonymous scores and they have comments, but do they represent the group dynamics? Am I getting an accurate representation of what's kind of going on? And can they help me as an instructor identify problematic group interactions so that I can do some intervention? So remember, we have, half the class has high performing and the other half has low performing. And we asked them, please provide written comments about your team members. And there were some 1,200 complete answers that we looked at. So that's a lot of comments. And rather than doing this kind of thematic analysis, we went in instead with kind of more a priori codes. So we knew there's been, 50 years of work on group work and a lot of work in particular on social interdependence theory, which I think I picked up on in the chat when people were saying that they felt like, this idea of individual accountability, like you would be responsible for completing someone's share of the work, the learning support, we were hearing that from the students in the interviews, some kind of procedural support. So this idea of a group can keep the group organized and focused. So it's not necessarily all about learning. It's also about kind of some of the social interactions that are going on. Communication, trust, and conflict resolution. Positive interdependence, which has been really pushed in particular by Johnson & Johnson. It's the belief that the group can only achieve their goals if all the members achieve their goals as well. So it's like everybody's got to pull together. We can't have one weak link in there. And then this idea of emotional support, so opportunities to reflect and improve on what they're doing. We added a couple of additional codes that we didn't see in the social interdependence theory, and those were like just negative and positives. So we're like, this is just so clearly a negative statement. And so within each of these different 6 groups, there might be a negative and positive version. So we end up with like 12 total. So we went through and looked at where did they fall in terms of these codes. And so if we looked at high performing groups, most of the codes in terms of their peers were about doing their part, like this individual accountability. So that's somewhere around 56. And so at the top, we have the ones at the middle of the semester, and at the bottom, the end of semester comments. We got some, next highest was learning support, like help the team understand. And then the final one is procedural support. So keep them on track, organizing, setting deadlines, things like that. We also got a little smidge, not till the end of the semester, that hinted at this idea of positive interdependence. So it's sort of an indication that it may take time to kind of develop that idea that, you know, if the whole team works together, that's when we get the best gains in our own learning, and only if the whole team works together. So things like that just encourage me to work harder, knowing that they're relying on me to do well in my portion. So these are the high performing groups. And what we were interested in is, are the comments different if you're in a low performing groups? Like, do they talk more about like learning supports or positive interdependence or things like that? So here we see the lower performing groups and slight differences, but in general, they also make the same kinds of comments. So individual accountability, learning supports maybe a little bit higher, interestingly, at the end of the semester. Nothing about positive interdependence, which is sort of interesting. That might just be a little icing on the cake when you have a really high performing group. So kind of my conclusion from this is that these comments are not really helping me identifying a high and a low performing group. They're just, everybody's kind of experiencing the same kinds of negative and positive things in their groups, just kind of interesting. So then, you know, we did, in addition to the comments, we also used those scores. So ideally, people have said, you know, you can use the scores to maybe deduct points from students that are getting really poor ratings. So there's a 1 to 4 scale, and 1 is a very poor. And people have recommended using them to kind of deduct points from students. And at the time, I'm sad to say that I actually did that. They'd have to be real bad, but I took it as like an indication. And so on the next slide, I'm going to show you what we found, and I'm going to give you a chance to kind of conclude what you can conclude from this. So here we go. So this is the average peer rating. So they had 8 questions with 4 different scales on there. So you could earn quite a bit. Positive, they could go a little higher if they wanted, or a little negative. So that's why it's like a little above 100%. And here we have high scores and low scores. So remember, that's your individual scores, like how you're doing on tests and assignments individually. And then I've got them separated in 2 panels for both the high performing groups on the left and the low performing groups on the right. So I wanted to give you guys a minute to just look at this graph and tell me what you think your takeaway is in terms of what's going on here. So you can put it in the chat, or you can just think it. Awesome. Okay, we've got a few little answers. I love Steve's comment, punishes the low performers more in low performing groups. Yeah. Students who know the material are perceived as being good group members, possibly regardless of their actual contribution. So again, the low scores and the high scores, this is on their individual levels in the class. So they should be relatively equal to each other, right? They were bottom third of the top third of the class in terms of their scoring on exams. And what you're seeing is in a high performance group, the low scores are getting very similar scores on their perceived contributions to the team. And then the low scorers are getting really bad, right? They're down 85%. So if you, like me, had been prorating their scores in the class, they're already high scores lift all boats. That's hilarious. What I came away from it was like, if you're a low scorer and you're in a low performing group, you're getting double dinged because already your group's not doing well. And then when they do the evaluation of you, you could be dinged again. So it's almost like, I don't know, this, the minute it starts to go south, like you're watching your team and they're performing in a soccer game and now they're losing and now they're all yelling at each other, right? But when we're winning, everybody's happy. Even the worst kid on the team, you're like, yay, we all did it together. So yeah, maybe low scorers clearly, maybe they're not doing well, but they're in a high performing group. And so they're getting good scores from their teammates. Yeah, better to prioritize group to be a high. Is performance the only dimension important for students? Gender and racial bias. Yes, that's a great question. That we did not do in this, although we attempted to. We are a predominantly white institution, and so the statistics on our underrepresented students is really small. And so although we tried, it was really difficult. And we did actually look at male and female, and we didn't see any differences in terms of the gender. Okay, so let me keep going a little bit. So let's just talk a little bit about the peer evaluations, and then I'll look at some final suggestions and I'll open it up to questions. So there were some similar, but also some different perceptions between students in high and low performing groups. The most common feedback that they gave on their written evaluations was completing their fair share of the work, participating. Students in the high performing groups were the more likely to mention positive interdependence, but this only kind of came at the very end of the semester. And students in lower performing groups were less likely to mention that their peers provided learning supports until the end of the semester. And they gave their lower score members, I say, harsher ratings. We don't really, who knows, maybe they were contributing less in the group. I don't know. But in terms of their abilities and how they were contributing on their own assignments, they were given harsher ratings compared to students in the same kind of groups that were higher performing. So conclusion, sad. Without a lot of supervision, students failed to use their role assignments. This came from the interviews. Sometimes they would say this was due to an inactive or maybe an absent member. They'd say, we had 4 roles, but one member wasn't there. So we kind of fell apart. We couldn't actually use the roles that you assigned. They also said that the number of students and the size of the class made it really hard to hear ideas from all the students during a class discussion. So they said that was kind of why they fell apart in terms of using the roles. They also were very clear about rather than everybody doing a different role, they just wanted to subdivide the labor. They were like, I just want you to do A, you do B, you do C. And then we'll just merge the contributions together in the final document without using the roles that I had suggested to them. And often there was really poor communication and last minute work. So although we would have one member who's supposed to be the editor, supposed to check everything out before they submitted it, that editor wouldn't have time because people were not turning it in on time. So what did we end up doing? One suggestion that I came up with, and this was from looking at the literature, was that it's really actually helpful to have students use cognitive prompts. So you actually say like the words that they're supposed to ask to each other to sort of force them to engage in the kind of conversation and exchange of ideas. So there's several papers that talk about that. And then the other thing is more scaffolding for individual accountability and deadlines. And so here's just a summary of how we took one activity that they did and broke it into pieces so that you as the instructor are enforcing individual accountability. So for example, they do a group worksheet on the pros and cons of genetic testing. And then we have them individually, each separately, explore a trait background assignment. So they have to explore a genetic trait and turn in this assignment for points so that that same day during class, they've actually thought about it each so that they can use the time effectively. You don't have somebody who just says, I didn't get to do it, I'm sorry. And then it makes the group work kind of fall apart. We also put in things like, not only do they have a synthesis, but they have a draft and then a final project before they do it. And so these were things that I was like, this is something that needs to happen because the way I'm doing the roles is just not really working. I need to take more ownership of what those roles are and take on more accountability. The second thing that we changed was the group contract. So students rightly felt that the assignment was cursory. They were not relying on them to set punishments or any other mechanisms to help resolve any kind of conflicts. So we threw it out. And instead, we have an assignment where they get to know each other better, to develop some connection and trust and, things like, what do you do for a job outside of school? What's your favorite food? What's your major? What do you like to do? So we have them do that instead, because at least they'll actually develop some trust. And instead, we set up these opportunities to promote individual accountability. We have more low stakes opportunities to identify social loafing. And then we actually just took over this. I mean, they're not going to report if there's a group problem. So we're like, forget it. We're just going to do it ourselves. So instead, I did a subsequent study with an undergraduate collaborator and one of my colleagues here, where we just asked a single question on a survey. It wasn't even an anonymous survey. We just said, do you currently have a problem working as a team with one or more members of your group? And we ended up with about 43 out of 290 so students who said, yes, I do. Then we asked them, what is the problem? We gave them a list of things to choose. And then we actually contacted any group that had a problem. Now, I have 150 groups, so you think that's a horrible amount of work. But this was a kind of a Sankey diagram, like a little river plot to show you. So of our initial groups, 296, 253, no problem. Of the 43 groups that reported a problem, we contacted all of them and we said, we see there's a problem in your group. We would like to interact in some way. So about 21 or half of them said, no, we're fine. And so we were like, okay, are they really fine? So we followed them till the end of the semester and we did a survey to see how satisfied they were with their groups. And what we found is that most of them resolved it on their own. We actually interviewed all of these groups as well. And the comments that they made were like, well, just the thought that we'd have to go and talk to you, we decided we would discuss it and resolve it ourselves. So, okay. A few, they were partially satisfied at the end, and a couple, we had a group member drop the class and that resolved the problem. So that's pretty good because I didn't even have to meet with these 21 groups. I did meet with 22 though. And these are all the possible things that might have happened. Some ended up either fully satisfied or partially satisfied. A lot had a group member drop the class, and that was really the problem. The student was just not ready to contribute at this time for whatever reason. And so they felt it was a better idea just to maybe withdraw from the class. We had a few where the absentee member just failed the class. So often in this class, if you do the work, you'll pass. And so they just maybe for a lot of reasons weren't willing to finish. We had a very small number where they finished the course unsatisfied. And when I talked to them, this was because they said, in the mediation, we went through this and we had a discussion and I thought things were going to be okay, but they actually never were. And a few small cases, the group dissolved or a member switched the group. And actually in those cases, they were quite happy they were like, yeah, I've been better since I've been, even the free riders, even the ones who were actively letting others do their work for them were more satisfied. So this was published in 2021 in the Journal of College Science Teaching, and it has made me feel a lot better. So now I do a lot of intervention because it works and it's not as scary as I thought it would be. I thought I'd have to talk to 400 groups. Okay, so implications for peer evaluation. Comments are no good. They don't adequately distinguish between high and low performance groups in my analysis that we did in terms of the comments that they're leaving. And we know, this is a study by Freeman and Greenacre from 2011 that was really interesting. It says that essentially students cannot distinguish peers who can't from students who won't, which is really sad. Right? So you've got students who are maybe not doing well in the group and they're lumping them all together, but can't do the work because you're struggling is different than is not doing the work because of a choice. And so we felt like this was super important to help students understand through that sort of discussion process. So I think without clarity, peer evaluations maybe are reinforcing these attitudes. You know, they're just lumping them all together. And a struggling student is really somebody who needs help. That's different than someone who just doesn't want or has decided not to contribute. So we completely changed the way we do our peer evaluation. So rather than have an evaluation, we do a acknowledgement section for each assignment. And it asks them to think about some of the cognitive behaviors as well as kind of some of the kind of interpersonal skills that people are actually bringing to a group. So rather than saying like how much they do, we just say, describe the contributions of each team member, and they all have to agree upon it. And then in addition, we ask them to give people a score, like how are they doing in communication, responding to texts and emails, checking and sharing what's been completed, expressing thoughts openly about your concerns. So it lets them know like, this is what a good group member does. They communicate. And then also we ask about asking good questions like learning support. And then we also ask about behavior. And we literally have them not only say what they would give people like good, fair, need some improvement, but we also say at the bottom, what can your group do going forward to improve on how you're interacting with each other? So to kind of think about like, how do you actually interact with people collaboratively that helps with your learning? So I have a whole list of great recommended reading, some of them that I brought up. I love this Chi account, Kadandal. So Pavan is at UC Irvine, and I love this class-based learning communities. If you haven't read this paper, it's phenomenal. So I put a link in there, and then some of the other references. And then with that, I am going to turn it over to some questions and see if I can answer. I'm sure there's some in the Q&A that I should be looking at.
Oh, Peggy, I will take care of facilitating the Q&A part.
Oh, good.
So
okay.
Don't worry about that. Awesome talk. Just I learned so much, and yes, I know Pavan. I had him give a talk for my chemistry department on that work last year. And
he's so hilarious too. I mean, he just makes
great.
You laugh.
Yeah,
and he's
fantastic.
clearly a genius because I love his ideas. So
yes, so good. Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes or so left in the official session. And we've got numerous questions in the Q&A. I don't think we'll get to all of them, but please vote up the questions that you really want to hear about, and we'll just go through them in descending order. The first one here is from, they keep jumping around. This is from Rebecca Disrude. Apologies if I mispronounce that. Do you have experience with allowing students to divorce group members? For instance, where do the divorced members go?
Oh yeah, this is fascinating. So that's part of that study that we published in the Journal of Science Teaching, College Science Teaching. We actually followed where they went. And actually, I have to say that it was both heartbreaking and also heartwarming. Sometimes the group would come in and talk, and the member who was maybe not contributing would say, like, I've been going through some health issues and I haven't been coming to class. And the other students are just white-faced. They're so kind of sorry. And they feel terrible because they're like, but I was like, no, it's fine. He wasn't contributing. So they were all sort of reached out and were like, well, how can we help you? What do we need to do? And, you should have let us know. I know it's personal, but, so it's really kind of heartwarming. And then I have other experiences with students who were like, I know I didn't do a good job. I got into a bad situation. I've been a terrible group member because I've said, it just doesn't look like you're really completing things. And I'm worried about putting you in a new group. No, I'm going to do better. And then, I check on them and I'll see that they are doing better. So sometimes people just need like a fresh start. I have also in the past, from necessity, because like I said, I'm loath to put them in a group unless they can tell me during the interview that they're like, no, I'm committed. I'm really going to do my work. I'm like, okay. But if they aren't, I'll sometimes have to put them into a group with others that have also not been doing their work. And you feel really bad about it. But then the student will come up and say, it's terrible now. I'm doing so much work. And what I always say to them, which is really funny, my co-instructor says, how are your test scores? And they go, oh, they're great. I mean, now I'm doing really well. So you're just like, okay. So maybe the tough love was a good thing in that case. But I usually am really conscious of trying to intervene really sensitively. So I'll say, to the student who's expressed the concern, it seems like you're the only one expressing this concern. How do you feel about having a discussion with just me? And do you want me to intervene in your group? I had one, which was one woman and 3 men in a group, and the 3 men were all engineers and the woman was not. And she said, they're just not listening to me. They talk over me. And I was like, okay, all right, I'll sit with you in class and we'll have a discussion with them. And then when it came time, she said, I just don't feel really comfortable. Like, I don't want to. And so I said, well, do you want me to talk to them? And she's like, yes, you can tell them that I'm leaving the group and this is why. And again, it was kind of heartwarming because they were like, but we didn't mean to do that. I'm like, I know, but y'all are all engineers and you all kind of speak the same language and you kind of talk over each other. And you could see how somebody who's not an engineer might feel a little overwhelmed. And so they kind of took it to heart. And I think she also, because I said, you need to, if you know things, like you should speak up. But I think it's just such a learning experience. I hope I didn't take too long on that one, but I know it's serious.
That's such a great answer. Thank you. That's a lot of really great information there. Let me move on to Saritas Shukla. How might prior experiences with group work have affected student perception of group work in this class?
Yeah, I think it's a huge thing. And that is one of the things that we share during the getting to know you. I have them share about their worst group experience with their group. We're talking about the group. We say, okay, what was your worst group experience? And they actually talk from the very beginning. They don't even know each other. And they're like, oh, I had to do everything. Or, everybody ghosted me or whatever. And so then I very clearly like, okay, so in order for this not to happen, we're going to be really clear. I also set aside class time whenever we start, like I said, there's scaffolding. So I'll say, okay, so we're going to do a group thing next week. So let's talk and make sure everybody's agreed that we're all good and they know what's happening. And if there's any problems, it's just really hard to bring it up. It's awkward. And so giving them time. And then a lot of them after the mediation meeting feel really good about it. And in that paper, we do recommend what should you do? What are the steps for mediation? And this comes from conflict resolution in industry. Right? It's like business management. There's some serious steps that you should go through. And the first one is definitely hearing from all sides, like what's going on. So everybody feels heard.
Right. Yeah, that they've been doing that for a while in business management.
Yeah. And it's why in business schools, group work is absolutely required because they're like, this is how we work. And in engineering too, required. It's like we work in teams. So you need to, it's like a really important skill to learn to do that. And it is not something that comes naturally to anybody. So the more time you think about it and reflect on it, the better.
That's great. Thanks, Peggy. I think we probably have time for one more, maybe 2. I'll go with Lauren Graham. Do you provide them with a way to communicate outside of class, such as Canvas groups or a different communication channel or board?
Yeah, I've tried so many different ways. So we don't use Canvas. We have Desire to Learn, but we've set up discussion boards and their students are like, nope. So you'll see them the first day, all exchanging their numbers and making a group me and a group chat. And so I feel like I've even tried it in Top Hat. They have a discussion forum because it was during COVID. And I was like, well, I feel awkward having them share their phone numbers with each other. Like I want that to be a choice. And so I set things up for them, but in the end, they just want to do it the way they want to do it. It would be nice. I know faculty, and there are some apps where you can set it up and then you can see when people are turning things in and doing things, or if you had Google Classroom, you can kind of see how the contributions are going. We do not have either of those, but I think those would be kind of nice if you wanted to let students know that their work was being monitored in a way that you as an instructor were ensuring that everyone was pulling their own weight.
Yes, absolutely. That would be key. I think we'll stop here and wrap up the session. But let me thank Peggy again. This was a wonderful talk.
Yeah, I wish I could be there in person. It would be so much fun.
Same. But I'm so glad you could make it, and I hope plenty of your UGA colleagues could come on the call as well.
I got one or two I know for sure. So they've heard this before. They're
tired. Okay. Excellent. So we'll wrap up now, and I want to just thank everyone again for joining us today. And I want to just do a quick plug for our next reflection and practice session, which will be on January 12th, again at noon. And in this session, UW Bothell professor Qingyi Chen will explore improvisation and speculation as pedagogical strategies to help students collectively reimagine today's challenges as engaged leaders. And in addition, we've got on December 2nd, another CTL session that may be of interest to folks. This one will be December 2nd from 2:30 to 3:30. A session put on by the CTL and the Office of Educational Assessment to explore ways to collect, utilize, and respond to student feedback, including end-of-term course evaluations. You'll leave this session with concrete strategies for using student evaluations and feedback to improve your teaching. And I will put a link in the chat did Jake already do this?
It's there.
Jake,
yep, it's there.
Thank you, Penn. I missed that. So Jake's put a link in the chat where you can register for both those events. And with that, I'll call time. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Peggy.
Thank
Peggy.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Closing slide. This concludes our program. Thank you. Learn more at https://teaching.washington.edu/. This program was brought to you by the University of Washington Center for Teaching and Learning.